I never thought that a simple weekend camping trip could turn into the most chilling experience of my life. It started out pretty normal. A few friends, a couple of tents, and a secluded spot in the forest, far from the city lights. We wanted an escape, just a place to unwind, laugh, and maybe tell a few ghost stories around the fire. But by the time the night was over, none of us would ever look at the woods the same way again. The first strange thing happened as we were setting up camp. Out of nowhere, we heard this low, guttural sound echo through the trees. It was like a deep hum, almost a vibration you could feel in your chest. We all paused, looking at each other with raised eyebrows. Probably just an animal, someone said, trying to brush it off. But even as they said it, I noticed their voice wavered. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. As the sun started to set, that uneasy feeling grew. The air felt thick, like it was charged with electricity, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. We tried to laugh it off, passing around drinks and telling each other that we were just letting our imaginations get the best of us. But I could tell that we were all on edge. Even the smallest sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made us jump. Then, around midnight, one of my friends noticed something strange at the edge of the clearing. "Hey, do you see that?" he whispered, pointing into the trees. We all turned and squinted into the darkness. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a patch of fog or mist hanging low to the ground. But then I realized it was moving. The mist wasn't just floating like fog. It was pulsing, almost like it was breathing. And as it moved, it twisted and curled, forming strange shapes that seemed to reach toward us. None of us said a word. We just stared, transfixed, as it crept closer, pushing the boundaries of the shadows, inching out of the trees and toward our campfire. One of my friends, Jake, finally broke the silence. "We should get out of here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I could see the panic in his eyes, but before anyone could respond, we heard it again. The same low, guttural sound from earlier, only this time it was louder, closer. It felt like it was coming from inside the mist itself. Against all logic, I found myself stepping toward it, squinting, trying to make out any details in the swirling fog. And that's when I saw them, faces. Not solid, not fully formed, but shadowy shapes that drifted in and out of the mist, like memories. There were eyes, hollow and empty, staring right at us, mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, and tried to say something, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. My friend Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and hissed, Did you see that?" Before I could answer, the mist shifted again, parting just enough for us to see something standing among the trees. It was a figure tall and unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. Its arms were too long, reaching down past its knees, and its head was tilted to one side as if studying us. It had no face, just smooth, pale skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. But somehow, I knew it was watching us. The faceless figure took a single, slow step forward, and the mist seemed to cling to it, swirling around its limbs like it was a part of it. No one moved. I could feel Sarah's grip on my arm tighten as we all watched, rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows across the clearing, and in the dim light, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were more of them. On either side of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, more faceless figures stood, just as tall and twisted, each one slowly inching closer, surrounding us in a silent, slow-moving circle. Their skin was pale, almost glowing in the dark, and they moved in perfect synchronization, like they were connected by an unseen force. Jake, who had been quiet up until now, let out a choked whisper, "Run. We have to run." But as soon as he said it, the faceless figures all stopped. It was as if they'd been waiting for us to make a move. Without another thought, we turned and bolted into the forest, stumbling over roots and branches, barely able to see in the dark. The mist was everywhere, thick and suffocating, wrapping around us like cold fingers. Every few seconds, I'd glance back, and I could see them. Those faceless figures, moving between the trees, gliding more than walking, somehow always staying just out of reach but close enough that I could feel their presence. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I forced myself to keep going, fueled by pure terror. The forest seemed endless, the trees twisting and closing in around us, blocking out any sign of an escape. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I heard Sarah scream. I turned, heart pounding, and saw her standing a few feet behind me, frozen, staring into the darkness. The mist had thickened around her, swirling around her ankles, creeping up her legs like it was alive. And then I saw why she was standing still. The mist was holding her. It coiled around her legs, climbing higher, binding her in place as if it had a mind of its own. Her face was twisted in horror, her hands clawing uselessly at the thick fog wrapping her arms, her waist, her neck. Every time she tried to scream, the mist seemed to tighten, cutting off her breath. I moved to help her, but Jake grabbed my arm and pulled me back, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't touch it," he hissed, his voice frantic. "I think it's like it's feeding off us." I watched, helpless, as Sarah struggled, her body slowly sinking into the swirling fog as it pulled her down toward the forest floor. Then, through the fog, I saw something shift beneath her. At first, I thought it was just shadows, but then I realized it was moving. Another one of those faceless things, clawing its way up through the mist, its hands stretching up to pull her down. She let out a strangled cry, her face pale, her eyes wide and pleading. I wanted to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed, frozen by the same fear that had gripped us all since the mist appeared. The figure in the fog wrapped its long fingers around her shoulders, pulling her closer, dragging her into the dark. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the mist let go. Sarah stumbled forward, gasping, falling to her knees as the fog dissipated around her. She looked up at us, her face pale and drained, her eyes wild with terror. I rushed to her, helping her to her feet, but she pulled away, mumbling something under her breath, her eyes darting around like she was seeing something we couldn't. What did it do to you?" I asked, but she just shook her head, backing away, her hands clutching her arms as if she were trying to hold herself together. And then, barely a whisper, she said, "They're still here. They're still inside." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but her words cut through the silence like a blade. "They're inside. They're waiting," she repeated, clutching her arms, trembling. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around as if she were seeing something lurking just beyond the shadows. Jake and I exchanged a glance, panic clawing its way up my spine. Whatever had just happened to her? She was not the same Sarah who'd been with us only moments ago. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. But Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond us, somewhere I couldn't see. It was as if she was staring right into the depths of the forest, her pupils dilated, her breathing shallow and rapid. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. "They're not done with us." Before we could react, she turned and started walking back, right back toward the clearing where we'd seen those faceless figures. Jake grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she jerked away violently, her strength almost unnatural. "Sarah, stop," I called out, but she ignored me, her movements stiff and unnatural, almost as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. Her face was blank, her eyes unseeing as she walked, step by slow step, back into the dark. "Sarah, please," I shouted, panic rising. But it was as if she was in a trance, her body moving forward without hesitation, compelled by some unseen force. Jake and I tried to keep up, but she was walking faster now, disappearing into the thickening mist, her silhouette barely visible. And then, as we pushed through the dense fog, we saw it. The clearing, bathed in a pale, unnatural light. The faceless figures were there, waiting, their elongated limbs stretching toward the sky, their heads tilted as if in silent anticipation. The figures stood motionless, their faceless heads turned slightly in our direction, as though they were waiting just for us. I could feel the air thickening, every breath heavy and cloying as the mist swirled in strange patterns around the clearing. Sarah continued walking toward them, her body moving with a rigid, almost puppet-like motion. Jake and I stood paralyzed at the edge of the clearing, too terrified to go forward, but too horrified to leave her alone. One of the figures stepped forward. Its movement was unnatural, each step jerky and disjointed, as if it didn't fully understand how to walk. It stretched a long, bony arm towards Sarah, fingers as thin and pale as bone, reaching out, beckoning her closer. And she responded. She raised her own hand, her face still blank and emotionless, and reached out to meet the figure's outstretched fingers. "Sarah, no," I shouted, desperation breaking through my paralysis. But it was too late. Her fingers brushed against the creature's hand, and in that moment, I saw something ripple across her face. An expression of profound, chilling calm. The mist surged forward, enveloping them both, and I watched in horror as Sarah's face began to blur, her features softening, fading. Her eyes, her nose, her mouth. All of it seemed to dissolve into a blank, smooth canvas. It was like watching her very identity drain away, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. Then the figure turned toward us, and I felt a stab of dread unlike anything I'd ever known. It wasn't just one figure anymore. There were two, and as they stood side by side, perfectly still, I saw that one of them, the one on the right, wore Sarah's clothes. The realization hit me like ice water down my spine. Sarah was gone. Whatever that thing was now, it wasn't her. It stood there motionless, with the same blank, featureless face as the others, but it wore her jacket, her jeans, her boots. The resemblance was horrifying, a twisted mockery of the friend we'd come into the woods with. Beside me, Jake was trembling, his eyes locked on the two figures. I could see him mouthing something, a silent plea, maybe, or a prayer, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away. The mist around the figures seemed to pulse, drawing closer, wrapping them in tendrils of vapor that coiled like vines. And then, slowly, both figures tilted their heads in unison, turning their blank faces toward us. In that instant, something snapped in Jake. He grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin, and whispered, "We have to go. Now!" He didn't wait for me to respond. He took off, tearing through the trees, and I followed, my heart pounding, each beat like a drumbeat in my ears. Branches whipped at my face, roots and rocks threatened to trip me with every step, but I pushed on, barely able to see through the dense fog that seemed to cling to us, stretching out long, ghostly fingers as if trying to pull us back. We ran, deeper into the forest, with no sense of direction, no thought except to escape. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, and each time my stomach would twist. Those figures were following us, gliding silently between the trees, their limbs moving in strange, erratic motions. They kept pace with us effortlessly. And though they had no faces, I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting, like a weight pressing down on my chest. After what felt like an eternity of running, Jake stumbled, falling to his knees, gasping for breath. I slowed, grabbing his arm, urging him to get up, but he just shook his head, his face pale and drenched in sweat. They took her," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "They turned her into one of them. Oh God, they're going to do the same to us." I opened my mouth to respond, but then I heard it, a soft, almost melodic whisper, drifting through the trees. It was faint, barely more than a breeze, but somehow, it cut through the silence with terrifying clarity. "Come back." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Sarah's voice. Hearing Sarah's voice, soft, melodic, and eerily calm, sent a chill down my spine. It was like she was standing right beside us, whispering in my ear, even though I knew that whatever was following us now wasn't her. I pulled Jake to his feet, panic flooding my veins as I whispered, "That's not her. Jake, we have to keep moving." But Jake didn't move. He just stood there, frozen, staring back into the mist, his face pale and expressionless. "She's calling us," he murmured, his voice hollow. "What if she's still in there?" "No," I said, shaking him, desperate to snap him out of it. "That's not Sarah anymore, Jake. Whatever that thing is, it's using her voice, her memories to trick us. We can't go back." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were glazed, his mind slipping under the lure of that voice. I could hear it too, growing louder, closer, each word sharper and clearer, like Sarah was right there in the mist, just beyond reach. "Come back. I need you," the voice called, sweet and tender, tinged with a softness that made it almost impossible to resist. Jake took a step forward, his body stiff, drawn toward the sound like a moth to a flame. I grabbed his arm, pulling with everything I had, but he was stronger than me, and the pull of that voice was relentless. And then the mist parted. Just a few feet away, in the dim, ghostly light, I saw her, or something wearing her face. She looked just like Sarah, down to the last detail. Her favorite jacket, her tousled hair, her lopsided smile. But her eyes were hollow, like two bottomless pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. She raised a hand, reaching out, her fingers curling in a gesture that beckoned us forward. "Please," she whispered, her voice echoing through the trees. "Don't leave me alone here." Jake wrenched free from my grip and started toward her. His eyes glazed over, his expression slack. I shouted his name, but it was useless. He was in a trance, moving toward her like he had no control over his own body. I knew I couldn't let him go. Summoning every last ounce of courage, I grabbed a thick branch off the ground and swung it, hitting him square in the back. He stumbled, breaking his gaze, and the spell seemed to shatter. He turned, confused and panicked, his eyes clearing as he saw the figure still standing there, waiting, her face twisted into something far more sinister. And that's when she smiled. A slow, chilling grin that stretched far too wide, distorting her features, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, gleaming in the dim light. Jake stumbled back, his face twisted in horror as he took in the twisted, monstrous smile on the thing wearing Sarah's face. It was like watching her image dissolve, her human features stretching and shifting as that grin spread wider, splitting her cheeks until it looked like her whole face might tear open. The mist around her thickened, swirling up in dark, smoky tendrils, wrapping around her like claws, twisting her form into something barely recognizable as human. The eyes went black, the grin stretched further, and a low, guttural growl started to emanate from deep within her throat. I felt the vibration in my bones, a sound that wasn't just heard, but felt, a primal, predatory growl that pinned us in place, too terrified to move. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. But Jake was still frozen, his eyes wide with terror, unable to tear himself away from the horror unfolding before us. Then the thing moved. It took a single step forward, its limbs jerking in unnatural, disjointed motions, like a puppet with its strings pulled too tight. The grin was still fixed on its face, wider and more grotesque with every step, its black eyes locked onto us, hungry, unblinking. I grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him with all the strength I had. "Run!" I shouted, this time louder, the urgency snapping him out of his trance. He looked at me, terror flashing in his eyes, and without another word, we both turned and bolted into the forest, crashing through the trees, our footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. But the thing was faster. I could hear it behind us, the sound of branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot, the low growl growing louder with every step. The mist clung to us, thickening the further we ran, making it impossible to see, to breathe, to think. It was like the forest itself was trying to trap us, pulling us deeper, closing in on us from all sides. Suddenly, Jake tripped over a root, falling hard to the ground with a gasp. I skidded to a stop, turning back, reaching out to help him up. But before I could reach him, a shadow fell over us. The creature loomed above, its twisted form silhouetted against the pale light of the moon, its eyes gleaming with malice, its too wide grin fixed in place. It stretched out one impossibly long arm, reaching toward us, fingers like claws ready to snatch us up. In a desperate burst of adrenaline, I yanked Jake to his feet, and together we scrambled away, ducking under branches, weaving through trees, putting as much distance as we could between us and that thing. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare see how close it was. All I could hear was that growl, following us, relentless, echoing through the forest. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into a small clearing, our breaths ragged, our bodies shaking. The mist had thinned here, and for the first time, we could see the night sky above us, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. But the silence was oppressive. I could feel it, an awareness, a watching, as though the whole forest held its breath. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, was the creature. It hadn't followed us. It hadn't needed to. It had been waiting for us. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless, as if savoring the moment. Its twisted form loomed in the darkness, stretching taller than I'd remembered, the mist writhing around it like snakes. The too-wide grin was still there, a horrifying slit of teeth gleaming under the faint starlight, and its hollow eyes seemed to bore into me, like it knew every fear I'd ever had and was feeding on them. Beside me, Jake whispered, What does it want?" His voice trembled, and I could feel the desperation in it. I had no answer, only a growing sense of dread as we backed away, hoping to find some way, any way, out of this nightmare. But the thing didn't move. It simply watched, that grin widening as if mocking our fear. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and monstrous, it spoke. It used Sarah's voice, but twisted, low and broken, like an echo from the bottom of a well. "Why are you running?" it rasped, dragging out each word, each syllable dripping with malice. My skin crawled. Hearing Sarah's voice, her real voice, coming from this thing made my mind reel, like a nightmare where reality itself had fractured. Jake, driven by either anger or sheer terror, stepped forward and shouted, "Where is she? What did you do to Sarah?" The creature tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural, almost bird-like. "She is here with us," it replied, gesturing toward the mist that swirled thicker, darker around its form. Shapes began to materialize within the fog, vague outlines of faces, twisted in agony, eyes wide and vacant. And there, among them, was Sarah's face, staring out at us with an expression of terror frozen in place. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat as I saw her trapped in that swirling mist, her face melting and reforming with every pulse of the fog. I wanted to scream, to cry, to tear that thing apart, but all I could do was stare, my heart racing, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. The creature took a step forward, and the faces in the mist moved with it, as if they were all part of the same living, breathing horror. It raised a long, clawed finger, pointing directly at me, and then at Jake, its grin widening. "Come join us," it whispered, the voice like a cold wind cutting through the trees. At that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. The forest wasn't silent because it was empty. It was silent because every living thing, every animal, every insect had fled, leaving us alone with this thing. We were in its domain, and it was playing with us, savoring our fear. I grabbed Jake's hand, gripping it tight. "We have to go. We have to go now," I whispered, barely able to keep the panic out of my voice. We turned and ran, tearing through the undergrowth, branches slashing at our faces, roots grabbing at our feet, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting as far away from that thing as possible. But as we ran, the mist followed, thickening around us, filling the air with that low, guttural hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I could hear whispers in the fog, faint but growing louder, voices calling out, pleading, each one sounding like Sarah, like someone we knew, like someone who had once been human. It wasn't until I glanced to my left that I saw it. Another one of the faceless figures, keeping pace with us, gliding effortlessly through the trees. And then, to my right, another, and another. They were closing in on us, surrounding us, their blank faces turned toward us, watching with that same empty malice. I felt my strength waning, my legs burning, every breath ragged. But the clearing was up ahead, a break in the trees, a faint glow that felt like the only shred of hope left in the darkness. We pushed harder, forcing ourselves to keep moving to reach that light. Finally, we broke through the trees, stumbling into the clearing, only to realize we were right back where we'd started. The fire was still smoldering, the tents untouched, and standing in the center of the clearing, waiting for us, was the creature. Only this time it wasn't alone. It was surrounded by more figures, dozens of them, all standing perfectly still, their heads tilted, their featureless faces all turned toward us. And at the front of the group, her clothes torn, her body rigid and still, was Sarah, or whatever was left of her. The creature raised its arm, and in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, it whispered, "Welcome home." The words echoed through the clearing, each syllable dripping with a dark, chilling finality. Welcome home. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Jake stood beside me, frozen, his face drained of color, his breath shallow and panicked. The creature, the thing that had once worn Sarah's face, stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, savoring every ounce of our terror. I glanced around, desperate for any way out, but the faceless figures had closed in, forming an unbreakable wall of shadows around us. Each of them stood motionless, their heads tilted, their blank faces eerily attentive, like they were watching a show just for them. And in that silent crowd, Sarah's figure stood at the front, her face hollow and lifeless, her eyes now two empty voids. Desperation clawed at me, and I took a shaky step back, but there was nowhere to go. The figures moved closer, a tightening ring around us, their silent forms pressing in, filling the air with a suffocating dread. The mist curled at their feet, dark and thick, creeping toward us as if it were alive. Jake grabbed my arm, his voice barely more than a broken whisper. "We have to fight. We can't let them take us." But deep down, I knew it was useless. We were trapped, caught in something ancient and powerful, something that had been lurking in these woods long before we'd stumbled into its territory. The forest felt alive, watching, and we were intruders in its lair. I steeled myself, refusing to give in to the fear that was tightening around my throat. "If we can't escape," I said, my voice trembling, "then we fight." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched, his face twisted in a mixture of terror and defiance. We both picked up sticks, pathetic weapons against the nightmare surrounding us, but it was all we had. The creature's grin widened as it watched us, amused, like it knew that our resistance was futile. "Come join us," it whispered again, extending a long, twisted hand. And then, in a single nightmarish movement, it lunged. Jake swung his stick, the wood splintering against the creature's arm, but it didn't even flinch. It reached out, grabbing him by the shoulder with fingers that seemed to sink right through his skin, like they were made of mist and shadow. Jake screamed, his body convulsing as the darkness spread over him, swallowing him inch by inch. "No!" I shouted, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him free, but the darkness spread to me too, icy cold and suffocating. I felt it creep up my arm, filling my veins with a numbness that stole my strength, my will to resist. The creature leaned closer, its face inches from mine, its hollow eyes boring into me, and I felt my mind slipping, my memories fading, my very sense of self dissolving into the darkness. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, cutting through the haze. It was Sarah's voice, buried deep within the mist, but clear and desperate. "Run. Please run." With the last shred of my will, I tore myself free, stumbling backward, the mist clinging to me like a living thing trying to pull me back. I looked at Jake, his eyes wide and terrified as the darkness swallowed him whole, his face disappearing into the void. I turned and ran, not looking back, forcing my legs to move, ignoring the sounds of whispers and growls that followed me through the trees. Branches clawed at me, the mist thickening, but I pushed forward, refusing to let it pull me back. I didn't stop, didn't think, just ran, tearing through the forest with every ounce of strength I had left. At some point, the mist began to thin, the trees opening up, and finally, mercifully, I broke through the edge of the woods, collapsing onto the road. The night was still, the only sound my ragged breaths and the distant rustling of leaves. I lay there, staring up at the sky, the stars cold and distant, feeling the weight of what I'd left behind. Jake was gone. Sarah was gone. And somewhere in those woods, that thing still waited, still watching, still hungry. I never went back to those woods. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear Sarah's voice whispering from the darkness, calling me back. The days that followed felt like a blur. My mind was stuck in those woods, replaying every horrifying detail. The mist, the faceless figures, the twisted thing wearing Sarah's face. I could hardly eat, hardly sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake's face as the darkness swallowed him. The blank, lifeless look that had taken over Sarah. I tried to tell people, friends, family, even the authorities. But every time I described what happened, their faces shifted from concern to disbelief, then pity. They thought I was traumatized, that I'd lost my mind. The sheriff even suggested that Jake and Sarah had just disappeared. People go missing in those woods sometimes, he'd said, his tone cautious, as if he were trying to console a grieving friend. But I knew the truth. They hadn't just disappeared. The forest had taken them. A few weeks passed and life went on, or at least it did for everyone else. I tried to go back to my daily routine, tried to pretend I was okay. But the memories gnawed at me, haunting me, every shadow and creak in my empty apartment reminding me of that night. And then the nightmares started. At first, it was only glimpses. A flash of Sarah's face in the darkness, Jake's scream echoing through my dreams. But the dreams grew darker, more vivid, until I was reliving that night over and over, feeling the cold mist on my skin, hearing the whispers surround me. Each night, I found myself back in that clearing, the faceless figures closing in, the creature stretching its hand toward me, inviting me to join them. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and looked over at my phone. A text notification glowed on the screen, the message marked as unread. It was from Jake. I froze, my blood running cold as I stared at the message. "Come back. We're waiting for you." I told myself it was a trick, some horrible prank or a glitch in the phone system. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't Jake, not really. I could feel something watching me through the screen, something that had crossed from the forest into my life, something that had latched onto me. For days, the messages kept coming, always at night, always the same twisted invitation. "Come back to the woods. We miss you. Come join us." Every message brought with it the same chilling feeling, like a hand reaching out from the darkness, tugging at something deep inside me. And each night, the pull grew stronger, the whispers louder, until it felt like the forest was right outside my window, waiting. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I typed a message back. "What do you want?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as I waited. Seconds passed, then minutes. I was about to turn off the phone when it buzzed, and a new message appeared. "You belong to the forest now." I dropped the phone, backing away, a wave of dread washing over me. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone out the window, to run as far as I could. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The forest had already marked me. Its shadows were in my mind, its whispers woven into my thoughts. And as the nights wore on, I felt myself slipping, drawn back to the trees, to the mist, to the faces that haunted my dreams. The pull was growing stronger, like roots wrapping around my soul, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. I don't know how long I can resist. I don't know how long I can keep myself from going back. But I can feel it. Every time I close my eyes, every time the night falls, they're still out there, waiting in the dark, watching. And one day soon, I know, I'll go back. The pull became unbearable. Every night, I would find myself drawn to the edge of the forest, standing there in the dark, staring into the endless rows of trees, feeling that familiar, sickening hum vibrating through me. The whispers grew louder, the shadows seemed to deepen, and sometimes, I could swear I saw faces. Jake's, Sarah's, hovering just beyond the tree-line, their blank eyes watching, waiting. Each night, I'd go a little further, stepping just inside the forest, drawn by some invisible force that I couldn't resist. I knew I should turn back, but it was as though my body was no longer my own. The whispers called to me, wrapping around my mind like vines, filling my thoughts with memories I couldn't shake, fears that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. And then, one night, I couldn't resist anymore. I went in deeper, moving through the trees in a trance, my steps slow and steady, like I was sleepwalking. The mist was waiting for me, curling around my ankles, thickening as I moved forward, swallowing the light from my flashlight until all I could see was the fog. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the sounds of my footsteps felt muffled, swallowed up by the dense mist that seemed to have a life of its own. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I was being led. The trees felt like they were shifting around me, guiding me, steering me deeper into the heart of the forest. I felt the air grow colder, the whispers intensifying, filling my ears, drowning out every rational thought. And then, suddenly, the mist parted, revealing a clearing up ahead. It was the same clearing from that night, the same place where I had last seen Jake and Sarah, where I'd first seen the creature and the faceless figures. My heart pounded as I stepped into the open space, my eyes scanning the shadows, half expecting to see those blank faces staring back at me. But the clearing was empty. I took a few shaky steps forward, the silence pressing down on me, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The fog swirled around my feet, curling and twisting like it was alive, reaching out to pull me in. And then I heard it, a soft, familiar whisper. "Come join us." I froze, my breath hitching as I looked around, searching for the source of the voice. It was Sarah's voice, clear as day, as though she was standing right beside me. But when I turned, there was no one there, just the mist, swirling and churning, shaping itself into vague forms that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Jake?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Sarah?" There was no answer, only the whispers, weaving together, growing louder, like 100 voices overlapping, all calling my name, all urging me deeper into the fog. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure emerge from the mist. It was Jake, or what was left of him. He stood there, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes empty, devoid of life. His skin was almost translucent, like he was made of mist himself, his body flickering, as if he were a shadow caught between worlds. "Jake?" I whispered, my heart breaking as I took a step toward him. But as I did, I saw another figure emerge from the fog, and then another and another. Sarah was there too, her face as blank and hollow as Jake's, her eyes fixed on me with that same lifeless stare. And behind them, more figures began to appear, dozens, maybe hundreds, all standing silently, their faces empty, their eyes locked onto me. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by their gaze, by the endless sea of blank faces staring back at me, all waiting, all hungry. And then, from somewhere deep within the mist, the creature stepped forward, its twisted form looming over the others, its grin wide and sinister. "You're home now," it whispered, its voice low and guttural, reverberating through the clearing. "Stay with us. Become one with the forest." I felt the mist creeping up my legs, cold and suffocating, pulling me down, wrapping around me like chains. The faces watched, unblinking, as the fog tightened around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs, filling my veins with ice. My vision blurred, my mind slipping away, fading into the mist, becoming part of the darkness. The last thing I saw was the creature's face, that twisted grin, as it leaned in close, whispering one final time, "Welcome to the forest." And then, everything went dark. Darkness wrapped around me like a shroud, heavy and unyielding. I don't know how long I stayed like that, lost in that void, feeling the cold seep into my bones, my mind slipping further and further away. It was like I was dissolving, every thought, every memory draining out of me, until there was nothing left but silence. But then, somewhere in that black emptiness, I heard something. A faint heartbeat, steady and rhythmic, pulling me back from the brink. Slowly, painfully, I became aware of my own body again, of the cold ground beneath me, the dampness soaking through my clothes, the weight of the mist still clinging to me like chains. I opened my eyes, and at first, all I could see was fog, thick and swirling, as if it were alive, pulsating with every beat of that distant, echoing heartbeat. But as my vision cleared, I saw that I was no longer alone. The clearing was gone, replaced by a vast, open space filled with shadowy figures, hundreds of them, standing in rows, silent and unmoving, their hollow faces turned toward me. Each of them had the same blank, featureless expression, their eyes dark and empty, as if they were staring right through me. And there, in the center of them all, stood the creature. It was taller now, its limbs stretched and elongated, its face a twisted parody of a human smile, wider and more unnatural than before. Its hollow eyes glinted in the dim light, and as it looked at me, I felt a wave of dread wash over me, strong